Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
One of the things we talk about here at Personality Hacker, in fact, a lot of the messaging around typology, Myers-Briggs system in general, around your personality type, is growth-oriented. And one of the things that we really focus on is growing that, what's technically called your auxiliary cognitive function process. We have a CAR model we use, and we've called that the co-pilot. And if you don't know what the CAR model is, what cognitive functions are, what a cognitive function stack is, I recommend you going over before this conversation just to get familiar with this, because we're going to use some technical terms in this podcast particularly. We have resources on the website, personalityhacker.com. You can punch in the CAR model in the search bar and find some information on what we mean for this. And our recommendation, if you do know what I'm talking about in the CAR model, is to focus on that co-pilot or auxiliary cognitive function and grow that in your personality. We believe it's one of the highest leverage things you can do is put attention and time to not just having a natural talent for whatever that is in your personality, but build skill, play with it, be present to it, and really work and focus on growing that part of you. So that's the advice we give a lot. And we just did a podcast, several podcasts ago about what happens if you've gone ahead and done that work. What do you do next? And we talked about the third position of the tertiary cognitive function in your cognitive function stack, or what we call the 10-year-old in the CAR model. And that's another place you can focus if you've really matured and you've worked on your co-pilot or auxiliary function to the degree where you can now go to the next level. And then I think it was a couple weeks ago on the podcast, we talked about the loop. You know, there's this idea of a loop where you're in your primary or driver cognitive function, and then you tend to loop and skip past that co-pilot and get into this unhealthy cycle of a loop between your primary, your dominant driver cognitive function, and your 10-year-old tertiary cognitive function. And we described some of the limitations and some of the thought around that in a podcast a little while ago. And out of that podcast, I just happened to be skimming through our online Facebook group, Intuitive Awakening group, and I noticed that people were discussing that idea of the loop. And this idea came up around, well, that's fine for the driver dominant position and the tertiary 10-year-old position. But I've noticed in my life, people were saying online, kind of in an anecdotal sense, I'm reporting this back to you listening, that there's a loop for them in their co-pilot or secondary position, auxiliary position, and their inferior or 3-year-old position in the CAR model. And we described on the podcast with the tertiary and dominant loop that the reason why that loop can often happen is because both of those cognitive functions in your personality are of what's technically called the same attitude. So for example, if you are an extrovert, that dominant or driver function is going to be extroverted. And by definition, that means your 10-year-old or tertiary position will also be extroverted. So you're used to living in the extroverted world. So it's very easy to get caught in that loop. But what happens if you are growing yourself and you swap? So for example, just to give you something to tether this to, I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. So my growth path, if I'm going to drink my own Kool-Aid, is to say I need to work on my secondary or auxiliary function, which is introverted feeling. We've given it the nickname of authenticity. I'm an extrovert, but I have to work on the introverted part of myself, that introverted feeling part of myself. Well, I've noticed this conversation stimulated a thought in my mind. I've noticed that when I go to that place, when I go to that introverted part of myself to work and to really build skill there and to find out what all that means for me and to kind of build this identity and part of my personality around this, obviously, I'm in the same attitude that is my inferior or 3-year-old function. And anecdotally, I've noticed in my life, I don't know if you resonate with this personally, Antonia, but I've noticed that that's messed with me a little bit. Because now I'm in this territory, I'm trying to grow this part of me, but I'm also in this area, or this part of myself, this introverted part of myself, where now I have much more access, much more, I would say it's not conscious access, but it's almost conscious access to this part of myself that's always there, but it's usually unconscious. And it's thrown some monkey wrenches in my development. I think it's been some of the source of frustration for me and some false starts in my development because I've sometimes mixed up what I'm actually doing in this introverted space. It's new for me. It's something that I'm not used to yet because I'm an extrovert. So I'm playing with this concept. I don't think there's a loop here. I don't think it's similar to the loop that's the dominant tertiary loop or the driver, 10-year-old loop. But there is something to be said for when you're in that space there's some influence that comes from that not lower part of yourself, but that inferior expression of your personality, that little kid inside you, I think that can mess with your growth and development. It can just throw some monkey wrenches into that process. So today I'd love to talk a little bit. It's more of an exploratory conversation around, some of the anecdotal things we've noticed when people are growing their personalities, some of the stuff that might come up depending on your type in kind of a general principle. And then what we can do is turn it over to you listening to see the specific maybe application or the example that you could pull from your own life to help us co-create some conversation around this.
Yeah, so the dominant-tertiary loop serves a very specific purpose, and that is defensiveness and maintaining cognitive dissonance. Like, that's what the loop does for you. And people stay in the attitude they're most comfortable with because they're most comfortable with it. And they don't want to get out of their comfort zone to go to the opposite attitude, whether that's introverted or extroverted. As far as this idea, because that was the conversation in Intuitive Awakening, was this idea of a loop between your auxiliary, secondary, or your inferior 3-year-old process. And like you said, I don't know if there's a loop. And the reason why I don't know if there's a loop that happens, or like a loop that happens like the dominant tertiary loop, is because I can't figure out what purpose it serves. Like, I'm really thinking here, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly would that do for the person. And the only thing I can think of is that, as you mentioned, it's unfamiliar terrain in the opposite attitude from what you're comfortable with. And so you end up there. Like, you end up doing all the... like with me, I'm an ENTP, I end up in an introverted space, and so I end up doing all the introverted things that my mind is used to doing, whether on a conscious or unconscious level. Or if you're an introvert, that would mean that you're in the extroverted world and you're just doing all the things that you're used to doing when you're in an extroverted space unconsciously. So I don't know if I've ever experienced a loop, or if I have experienced a loop, I don't know if I've been aware of it. I do think, though, like you said, the reason why it's such an interesting idea is because it might be a reason why people resist developing that co-pilot or auxiliary process. If it's going to put them in terrain where they're also bumping up against or unconsciously exploring their inferior process, which most of us don't feel real good about when we get there. Like, it's definitely...
It icks us out a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, not always. If we're doing pleasurable things in the inferior process, that doesn't ick us out at all. But if it puts us into a place in our inferior 3-year-old where we're like, yeah, this is definitely not okay. This is, if I go into an introverted sensing space where all of a sudden I've got to do like a ton of paperwork or something, or if even I go to a space where I can't make peace with how reality is working or panning out. I think one of the things that people who have introverted sensing as a dominant and even auxiliary process do exceptionally well is they really understand and integrate the passage of time. Like, they're so good at recognizing that, and they're so good at making peace with the passage of time. They don't feel stuck. They just know in like a very philosophical way that this is how time works, and it passes, and they don't have a sense of anxiety about that passage of time most of the time, especially if they're in a healthy space. But if I get into my inferior of introverted sensing and I'm like starting to think about the passage of time and how time seems to be happening to me, because I've been in my extroverted intuition process of like getting involved in things that are novel and exciting, and I'm not thinking about the passage of time, I'm just in that process, and then I emerge and I go, holy crap, like how much time has gone by? I mean, all the way from like 2 weeks, 2 hours, 2 weeks to 2 years to 2 decades, and I'm like, oh, I'm not, wait, you mean like I'm not 20 years old anymore? You mean I'm pushing up against my 40th birthday? How did that happen? So I think when we go to that inferior place and whatever aspect of that people who use it as a skill, right, they're naturally talented at it, would have no problem with it whatsoever, but you're thrown in that place and you don't know what to make of it. Like, you don't know what to do with this information. I could see that anything that maybe touches that or gets you even close to it would be something you might want to avoid. And if it's living in the same world as your auxiliary or secondary process, I could see avoiding that space because it's just bumping up or getting way too close to that place where you really haven't made peace with that aspect.
You used to use the phrase a lot more in the early days of our podcast when we would talk about going and growing that auxiliary or co-pilot place. You'd say, there be dragons, right? And, I'm thinking about that now. where are the dragons? Are they really in the co-pilot or auxiliary? Because ostensibly, that's a part of our personality that we pull upon a lot. We have a lot of talent, but not skill developed. So where are those dragons coming from? What are we not really wanting to go there and see? That really is the question that comes up for me in thinking about this. And for me personally, it's a lot of the stuff that's anchored in my inferior process, not in my co-pilot. But I know when I'm working on my co-pilot, it's like that's the workroom I'm in. And so that little introverted part of me that's over there, that introverted sensing part of me, that memory process as my 3-year-old or inferior process is in the same room, and it's going to make itself known. And so there be dragons, quote unquote, that are there, I see as the stuff there that I don't know. It's so inferior part of me. I don't know how to deal with those things. And I think, and that's been weird for me too in the last few years as I've really focused on growing this part of my personality. All those things you talked about, like these stuck feelings, the things that would be the negative expressions of introverted sensing have been coming up for me more than they've ever come up for me in my entire life because I'm much more introverted now. I'm spending much more time in reflection. So it's enabling that stuff to just bubble up to the surface, but I don't have the sophistication or tool set. And so the dragons that come up, quote unquote, now I've got to figure out how to deal with these. And it almost pulls the energy and resource from the work that I'm trying to do with my introverted feeling process as my co-pilot. And I've seen the struggle. The struggle is real in a sense through that.
I'm trying to think of any moments where I would have been in a loop with the auxiliary and the inferior. And the one moment that comes up for me is in the past, especially when I was really working on introverted thinking. And I don't think this has happened lately, but I know it's happened probably within the last couple of years, is you'll say something that just gets caught inside of me, something that I think is painful or something that I think is portending bad things or whatever, and I'll get hyper focused on a phrase you use, and we'll end up in an sometimes there are fights. If there are fights, because of me, I'm the person who makes it into a fight. But we'll be in a quote unquote fight, which is like me kind of FE freaking out, like extroverted feeling freaking out. But really what it is I'm stuck in this introverted place where I can't get out of this this phrase you've used. I've hyper focused on it, and then I keep repeating it over and over. But you said, and then I'll repeat the phrase. And the phrase has extraordinary meaning to me, even though you may not have meant at all what I interpret, my interpretation of it. You might have just been saying that, that was just you weren't being super careful. You were just saying the thing that came to you and you mentioned it, and I interpreted it in this really horrific way, and now I'm stuck there. And I when I was thinking about that, I was like, well, maybe that's the loop, because my introverted thinking process really grabbed onto very specific interpretation of what you said, and then my introverted sensing got caught and then just started saying it like a broken record. And then I thought, I don't know if that's a loop. I think what's happening there is that I personally feel, okay, I'm going to just give a sort of a theory right now. And this is kind of something that we've been on about. And I'm going to apply this situation, and you need to know this theory in order for me to apply it. But the theory is that I think that we make up for the deficiencies in our inferior process with our auxiliary process. I think that it's actually a combination of our dominant and auxiliary together. As an ENTP, I make up for my blind spot of introverted sensing by getting really good at extroverted intuition and introverted thinking together. I make up for my blind spots of not being able to sort of quote unquote make peace with the passage of time, or getting stuck, or feeling like it's not okay, or getting overwhelmed with whatever's the infrastructure around me. I do that by getting rigorous with my interpretation of reality. And I get really good at clean slicing information. And then I use the two processes together to find solutions, right? I find creative solutions to get out of what would be otherwise considered an introverted sensing problem. And I feel like everybody does that. I think no matter what your personality type is, you figure out a way to transcend the challenges of your inferior with the two processes that you lead with. I think of INFPs who, maybe have a real struggle in systematizing their life, but they find creative solutions to getting, their stuff handled by going to extroverted intuition and trying out a lot of things and just getting into an energized space where now they feel so in flow with their introverted feeling and extroverted intuition. It's kind of okay that they're not super efficient because they're still getting things done.
I look at ENTJs similar too. That introverted feeling process of kind of resonating with other people's feelings they may not be attuned to, but that NI, that introverted intuition part of them can really help them understand what's going on for somebody. And then they can synthesize the emotional experience that person might be having.
Yeah, and the same thing for conversely, ESFPs. They can use, to make up for that introverted intuition, the perspective shifting, they can use their extroverted sensing to get really good at watching people's body language and seeing how they show up in reality. And then using their introverted feeling, like their understanding of how they would feel in situations and that emotional intelligence to be able to figure out what's going on with another person because they're reading their body language and understanding emotional components. So it's like there's a variation of this for all 16 types. We make up for our inferior by utilizing our dominant auxiliary. And I think what's happening for me in those moments is that I haven't figured out how to use my introverted thinking tool to make up for my introverted sensing belief. Because what happens for me in introverted sensing is I get these beliefs about how reality works, almost like rules about how reality works, that are not healthy for me, but they've been in there for a long time, and maybe they were said by somebody who I really trusted as a young person, and now they're just stuck and I can't get them out. Like I've tried to pry them out with the crowbar. I've done work and therapy and development and meditation and psychotropics and I've just used all these different variations of trying to get the shit out of me, right? This belief out of me, and I haven't figured out how to do it. And so what ends up happening is my introverted thinking process is not yet sophisticated enough to help me figure out the solution to this challenge. And so it doesn't feel like a loop. What it feels like is I'm stuck in an SI belief, in an introverted sensing belief, and my TI is trying so hard to navigate me out of it. It is trying so hard, but it is not yet there. It is not there yet. So it doesn't really feel like a loop. It more feels like a frustration. It feels like I'm not looping between the two. It's not like they're codependent. Like the dominant-tertiary loop is based entirely on cognitive function codependency. Like they need each other in this moment. But it's not a codependency. It's more like a puzzle I haven't solved, or like a Chinese finger puzzle I can't get off my fingers. Like they're stuck there together. My two fingers are touching each other and I can't seem to separate them because this thing is stuck over them. And I'm trying so hard to get myself out of it. And they're just stuck together. And I think because of that, it feels like a loop, but I don't think it's quite a loop because it's not serving a codependent function. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I could also see a narrative emerging for different types based on the functions that are there. So I could even see a narrative, like for myself, I could see the loop between my introverted feeling and my introverted sensing. I could almost see a loop developing because introverted sensing feels like a stuck type position. Like I'm trying to think in terms of, maybe you're an INFJ listening, right? And your co-pilot or your auxiliary would be extroverted feeling, and your inferior or 3-year-old would be extroverted sensing. And I don't see those two necessarily getting into a loop with each other because neither one of those express a stuck feeling. It's not, and when I say stuck for introverted sensing, I don't mean that's in its healthy version in the way it's expressed for me, particularly in my personality. So I almost could see a narrative emerging where different types experience a loop there based on the functions themselves, where maybe for me, there is a little bit of a loop because in a sense, introverted sensing is a little bit of a loop. You keep looping back on something that you already know about. You already keep looping back on what's precedent or a reference experience you've had. That's why we call it memory, right? You're looking back at the impressions of memories and reference experiences over time and how those over time have impacted you. And then you post-processes all your inputs through this experience of what's come before to know how you feel about it or how you're going to map it to the present. So it's somewhat of a timeline of it in of itself. So I can almost see certain types feeling more looped than others in this.
I think did you have more you wanted to say?
No, I think I just want to throw that out as an idea.
I'm glad you did, because as you were talking about INFJs, I was really kind of sort of mentally going through this idea of like, what would that look like for an INFJ? And the first thing that came up for me was this idea of extroverted sensing as an inferior being the place where maybe you overindulge. Let's say it's food. All right. So you have a tendency to overindulge food. And extroverted feeling can become overindulgent with food because it feels like nurturing. Like extroverted feeling wants to get needs met, and one of the most profound fundamental needs for humans is food and nourishment and nutrition.
And we tell people get your own needs met too.
Right, exactly. So I could see an INFJ almost feeling like they're caught in a loop with maybe self-medicating with food. And that feels like a loop for them. I still wonder, though, if it's not exactly a loop, it's the extroverted feeling process as a tool trying to figure out how to satisfy extroverted sensing when they're caught there and just not yet having the sophistication to do it. Like, if you have really good extroverted feeling, then you're getting your own needs met and you recognize that a need is not a want. A need is a need. Like nourishment is a need, but lots of cookies is a want. And so extroverted feeling just isn't quite yet the tool for the job to understand how to get one's needs truly met. And you're just not quite there in sophistication. And your extroverted sensing is being very insistent. And so it's demanding from you, like it wants extroverted feeling in the outside world. It needs something in the outside world, right? Like that we know that. Whatever is the attitude of the inferior, that's where you need to be when you're trying to control it, not have it control you. If I'm an introverted sensing, I need to be in an introverted space. And so it's going to pull me into that introverted space, and introverted thinking is going to be a primary tool I use to try to figure out that space. And the opposite holds with extroversion. If you're needing to be in an extroverted sensing space as an INFJ, extroverted feeling is going to be one of the tools you use in order to get those needs met. And I think what happens in that space, again, is I don't know if it's quite a loop. I think it's more like extroverted feelings just trying to figure out what extroverted sensing really, truly needs. And it's not quite at that level of sophistication. It hasn't worked that puzzle out quite enough to be able to do it in a healthy, nourishing way.
I also think of terms of the car model, for example, posits this idea that there's two adults in the front seat of your car and there's a 10-year-old and 3-year-old in the back seat. So there's almost like a family dynamic going on, right? The two adults in the front are going to parent the two in the back of your personality. Let's just use that metaphor and extend it into real life. Growing up, you probably had a parent that you identified with more than the other, that you were maybe more, it wasn't your favorite parent, but it was your intimate parent. Or if you're a parent now, you probably have a child you identify with more over your other children. You don't have a favorite child, but you have an intimate child, a child you connect with in some ways. And so extending the metaphor this way too, thinking in terms of, when the parent's doing work, it's almost like the co-pilot and the 3-year-old in the back seat have an interesting relationship with each other. They have an intimacy of relationship, just like the driver and the 10-year-old or the tertiary. They have an interesting relationship as well. And it's based on attitude, right? Introverted, extroverted attitude. And it's almost like the relationship there, the dynamic is that when that parent is... I remember this in families, like family dynamics, watching like my friends' families, even my own family, even my own children, certain factions of the family can gang up on the other factions. And in a playful way. It doesn't always have to be mean or anything, but it could be like, mom and the one child that mom's close to want this thing in a restaurant or something, and they gang up on the rest of the family to get their way, or but the mom is not like, have you see this dynamic? You know what I'm talking about? I mean,
yeah. Oh yeah, totally.
Am I explaining myself correctly? Okay. There's like these little family dynamics that emerge
Yeah.
and they don't necessarily have to be perceived as negative. That's not how I want to posit this. But these little family dynamics, these coalitions or these alliances. Mm-hmm. And so I'm playing with this idea of, it's almost like there's this coalition or alliance among the attitudes in our personality. It's not necessarily a loop, but it's definitely it's not codependent, but there's this simpatico fondness, something going on there. In that, and I'd love to hear your perspective too, if you're listening, what you maybe get from what I just said, because it's definitely an intuitive idea that came up, it bubbled up for me. So I'm kind of thinking as I talk, but there's something to be said for that, in that you have a tendency to also need your co-pilot to parent in a sense, because they have an intimate relationship. It's almost like the co-pilot's going to get that inferior process more than anybody else in the car, right? They kind of have a resonance together. And so it's almost the chance for the 3-year-old in your personality, the inferior part of you, to say, oh, hey, by the way, I need some attention now too. And that wasn't your intention. Your intention was to work on that co-pilot or auxiliary process. But, well, hey, if we're in this introverted room, or if we're in this extroverted room, whatever your personality would bear out, I want some attention now too. I come in tandem with the co-pilot or auxiliary process. I'm part of that, right? Like we're in simpatico. So that means when this part of you is getting attention, I should get attention as well. And they like put themselves into the mix, and they request attention put onto them.
And I'm wondering, as you were talking, you were triggering some thoughts for me. I'm wondering if the reason why when we work on our auxiliary process, our fear is that our inferior is going to show up and be like, me too, is because we haven't been giving the inferior enough attention. Like if there's a part of us that's neglected, it's going to look for any inroad to get that attention. And if every time we go to our co-pilot, our auxiliary, our inferior shows up, it means that we've probably been neglecting it. And so maybe one of the best ways to get out of, like, if that looks like a loop for you and you're listening to our podcast and you're like, you guys are smoking crack or something, because that's totally a loop for me and I can see it super clearly and I have all the reasons why it's a loop. All right, that's cool. That's fine. I've just never experienced, I'm not experiencing it as a loop and I'm not seeing it as a loop, but it's cool if it's a loop for you. That said, it could be, you know, how we talk about if you have a dominant-tertiary loop going on, the key is to get into your auxiliary, right? Like break the loop, like stop the loop, get into an extroverted or an introverted attitude, whichever is the opposite of the loop, get into that space and break the codependency of the loop, like redirect the energy instead of dominant-tertiary to dominant auxiliary-tertiary. That's the solution. And I'm wondering with this potential loop, or whatever you want to call it, if the solution is to go give yourself some attention in your inferior process. Most of us are ignoring our inferior. Most of us are, because we don't really like to go there unless we have to. And so it forces itself upon us, which is one of the reasons why it shows up unhealthy so often, is because like we get in the grip, right? That's what it's called, is being in the grip. And we get in the grip of our inferior because we have been neglecting it. And I'm wondering if the fear of going into the auxiliary process for growth and development is that the inferior is going to show up. Go ahead and give it the time it needs. Go ahead and attend to your inferior process. It doesn't matter what it is. And if you haven't developed a hack for your inferior, first of all, I never plug our stuff. Very rarely do I ever plug our stuff. But one of the things we have in the personality development starter kit are tips for hacks for your inferior. So I'm not going to go through all 16 types right now. But that is one of the things that we provide in those starter kits, is hacks for that. And the thing is that it's going to be different for you than it is for other people of your personality type. You're going to have to figure out your specific hack because, you know, an ENP is not an ENP is not an ENP. Like your hack, Joel, for introverted sensing, going there and giving it attention is different than my hack. So it's going to be different for each person, but there's going to be some trends around what that looks like. And sometimes it's just a matter of finding it. And sometimes if you've been neglecting it in a healthy way, it means that you just haven't figured out your hack yet. So go give that some time and attention. Maybe do that before you develop your auxiliary process. Figure out what that is and then go implement it. For me, introverted sensing is about passive entertainment. I watch TV shows that I know I'm going to love. If I'm in a super creative space and I've been working like crazy, I have I used to be crime shows, but I stopped doing that because I was getting all sorts of cookie dook stuff in my head. I was like, do we have serial killers in the house? I would check the pantry to make sure there was no serial killers in there. And I was like, maybe I'm watching too much Criminal Minds. If I've gone through all 12 seasons, maybe that's too much. So then I changed it to something else. I now watch The Voice or Project Runway or something very light and foofy. And I'll just watch those shows until I'm my eyes start to go a square shape. I've also done mood lifters and mood changers by going to music from my past. When as a teenager, this is an old reference and only people who are Gen Xers or above will probably get it. But I used to be a huge Rush fan in high school. As far as I'm concerned, Neil Peart's lyrics saved me from myself in high school. So I'll go listen to Rush and I'll listen to old, not the new stuff, but the old stuff. Anything from Counterparts before. This means nothing to anybody except for the one Rush fan out there is woohoo. But I'll go listen to old Rush that I listened to in high school and I'll do that kind of thing, or listen to, Dead Can Dance or something. And I'll go through anything that takes me to a place of passivity that that feels nourishing to me to some extent. I'm just trying to get out of my creative space because I have to have a rest from my extroverted intuition. For you, you do other stuff. What is it, the stuff you do?
I think music's a big one. I tend to revisit memories from the past, like photos, memories. I'll often get on anything from my childhood stuff that really resonated with me as a little kid. I might look at or go through online, look up resources or information on that.
Oh yeah, we were watching old commercials from like the 80s not that long ago.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Oh, and I was watching, that's so funny. I was watching like video games I used to play in the 90s. Like I was watching people play those video games on YouTube, just passively watching other people play video games that I used to play.
I'll watch video ride-throughs of rides that were like at Walt Disney World that I rode on when I was a kid that are no longer in service. Like they did away with them. So I'll go like relive something from my childhood and like watch a little video of somebody that shot something, a ride through of a ride or something like that. This is the stuff that I'll pull on for that.
Yeah.
And I think what you said really triggered something for me to say that the healing work I've had to do, like getting into my co-pilot, my auxiliary function, the healing work, I'm looking back and going, a lot of that was in my inferior. As I'm working to achieve and grow myself as a person, all this like stuff bubbled up that I had to heal. It was almost like I had to work on two fronts at the same time. I was definitely focused, and I still am, on that co-pilot auxiliary. But when I went there, all this stuff bubbled up that I almost had to attend to like right away that I wasn't expecting to have to attend to.
Yeah.
And I would throw little tantrums like, I hate working. I would freak out. Like, I'm like, I hate working on this. This sucks. Like, I can't stand it. I'm so destabilized. And I got all this healing stuff coming up for me. From looking back now over the past 5 to 10 years in this work I've done, it's all this healing stuff that was anchored in that inferior part of my personality that was just bubbling up. And there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for when you go to that auxiliary place, that stuff's going to come rushing in. Oh, now it's time to pay attention to this, and boom, it comes up. And you can ignore it and still kind of focus on growing yourself without attending to that. But I bet you when you start to attend to the healing that might have to come from, or whatever it was healing for me. It may not be healing for you. My guess is it might be for everybody. But some of the healing stuff that comes up for you, like that's going to be needed to attend to. But the thing is, what's great is I used, again, that whole like parent-child kind of like that relationship they've got, that intimate relationship they might have inside the family. I used my co-pilot, my auxiliary function, to heal. That's where the healing came from. So it was almost like the problem and the solution were all in the same introverted room for me. I went in there and I started working, and then all this healing came up, and I went, oh crap. And I started to rely on my tertiary or my primary cognitive function to try to fix things. I went, wait a minute. This is a great place for me now to use. It's like almost real world feedback. I get to test myself in my introverted space to heal myself using this process that I'm trying to work on anyway. So it was actually accelerated my growth because I was able to use the thing that I was developing to solve the problems that were emerging for me.
Yeah, and doesn't it kind of make sense that our trauma would live in the youngest part of us?
Yeah.
Like the part that's so fragile and so young and unsophisticated, doesn't it? I mean, it always seems to be that that's where we store our stuff. So it makes sense that a lot of that, if we have healing work we need to do, a lot of it would be living in that inferior. And I like what you just said because it helped me reframe from this idea of it being a loop or something you get stuck in. It makes me think more of it being a workshop.
Yeah.
Like if you go to your auxiliary process, regardless of whether or not it's introverted or extroverted, you're now in a workshop space. And some of that trauma might come up for you and you might have to attend to it. But I still wonder if part of it is that we oftentimes ignore the inferior. I mean, there's probably two tracks here. The inferior is coming up for you when you go to your auxiliary because you've been ignoring it and you just need to throw it a bone, basically. You need to go do the things that are nourishing to that part of your psyche, and you need to do it for as long as you need to do it. It's called rest, basically. You know what I mean? It's like rest and relaxation. So go do that thing, and whatever that is for you. And then if you notice that you're going to auxiliary process and a bunch of healing stuff is coming up for you, and that's when the 3-year-old or inferior like sort of raises its hand and goes, hey, remember me? And then it starts to kind of get aggressive or assertive into that process. It means that you've got a workshop situation going on, and it might not be a bad thing. It's probably uncomfortable, and it probably feels really bad because all work that's real work initially feels bad until you start getting the rewards of it. But I think that seeing it in a workshop scenario actually really helps me, because then I realize that when I'm going to introverted thinking and my introverted sensing beliefs start popping up, it's my opportunity to do what I can to sharpen the saw of introverted thinking, get rigorously rational, get really, truly like very good at creating distinctions around beliefs, and do what I can. Because I almost picture my introverted thinking as a scalpel. Like I frequently see it that way. Something that clean slices information and cuts the fat off of concepts. And I do see it when I have a stuck belief in introverted sensing. I do see it as something that comes in and kind of like its job is to sort of slice that up for me. And some of my beliefs are very calcified right now. The trauma beliefs that I have in my introverted sensing are hard to cut through because they're so calcified. And I think that if I get my TI, my introverted thinking, sharp enough, those beliefs will eventually be no match for it. So it's more of the place I need to be as opposed to something I want to run away from.
It's very introverted thinking of you to see your introverted thinking process as a tool. Right? Like, and I mean, I have a kind of a visualization for my introverted feeling process. I kind of see it as like this tuning fork energy field, right? I can pick up energies and I can send energies out. And it's definitely dealing with like emotional energy resonance is how I almost imagine it.
Is introverted feeling the tuning fork or is it the waves?
It's probably the feeling is actually the waves. I don't know. In classic introverted feeling, I don't have a lot of distinctions. It's kind of all just globbed together to some degree. It's like I have a sort of like glimpsey imagery. Of course, I'm not a visual person. I'm kinesthetic. So I have more of a feeling for it than I do a visualization of it, like being a tool or something.
Yeah.
So that's how I see my process. I think I like this conversation because I think it's an exploratory conversation, but I got a lot of ahas in the midst of it.
Yeah, me too.
And some distinctions emerged through conversing almost out loud here on the podcast. And I'd love to hear what you think listening. Are you resonating with this? Do you see some things we're not seeing? Do you have something to add to the conversation? If you do, come over to personalityhacker.com and leave a comment, ask a question just below this podcast. We can get a conversation going around this. And also come over to our community of like minds, people just like you. They want to know more about personality types, how to grow themselves as people, asking the questions that are dangerous questions to ask among friends that will support and play with you in that space. Facebook.com/personalityhacker or Twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
And of course, if you enjoy this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And we say this every week, but we really, truly mean it. If you leave us a rating review, that helps us a lot on iTunes with our ratings and getting higher in the charts and being more visible. And Joel last week said something really interesting that I might add it to my little sort of spiel at the end.
Good, do it.
Which is, if you could do us a favor and introduce us to a friend or family member, that would be really amazing.
I think it's doing yourself a favor because you have somebody you can talk to about it offline.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, it's like the beginning of community building, eh? Yeah, absolutely. So if you could leave us a rating review, that would be amazing. And if you could introduce us to a friend or family member, that would be amazing too.
Yeah, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.